Introduction to the Holocaust by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Holocaust was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime. Holocaust is a word of Greek origin, meaning sacrifice by fire. The Nazis, who came to power in Germany in January 1933, believed the Germans were racially superior, and that the Jews, deemed inferior, were an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority. Roma, Gypsies, the disabled, and some of the Slavic peoples, Poles, Russians, and others. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, among them communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. What was the Holocaust? In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe stood at over 9 million. Most European Jews lived in countries that Nazi Germany would occupy or influence during World War II. By 1945, the Germans and their collaborators killed nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews as part of the final solution, the Nazi policy to murder the Jews of Europe. Although Jews, whom the Nazis deemed a priority danger to Germany, were the primary victims of Nazi racism, other victims included some 200,000 Roma Gypsies. At least 200,000 mentally or physically disabled patients, mainly Germans, living in institutional settings, were murdered in the so-called euthanasia program. As Nazi tyranny spread across Europe, the Germans and their collaborators persecuted and murdered millions of other people. Between 2 and 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered or died of starvation, disease, neglect, or maltreatment. The Germans targeted the non-Jewish Polish intelligentsia for killing and deported millions of Polish and Soviet civilians for forced labor in Germany or in occupied Poland, where these individuals worked and often died under deplorable conditions. From the earliest years of the Nazi regime, German authorities persecuted homosexuals and others whose behavior did not match prescribed social norms. German police officials targeted thousands of political opponents, including communists, socialists, and trade unionists, and religious dissidents, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. Many of these individuals died as a result of incarceration and maltreatment. Administration of the final solution. In the early years of the Nazi regime, the National Socialist government established concentration camps to detain real and imagined political and ideological opponents. Increasingly, in the years before the outbreak of war, SS and police officials incarcerated Jews, Roma, and other victims of ethnic and racial hatred in these camps. To concentrate and monitor the Jewish population, as well as to facilitate later deportation of the Jews. The Germans and their collaborators created ghettos, transit camps, and forced labor camps in order to keep Jews grouped closely together during the wars. The German authorities also established numerous forced labor camps, both in the so-called Greater German Reich and in the German-occupied territory, for non-Jews whose labor the Germans sought to exploit. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, and later militarized battalions of order police officials moved behind German lines to carry out mass murder operations against Jews, Roma, and Soviet state and Communist Party officials. German SS and police units, supported by units of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, murdered more than 1 million Jewish men, women, and children, and hundreds of thousands of others. Between 1941 and 1944, Nazi German authorities deported millions of Jews from Germany, from occupied territories, and from the country of many of its Axis allies to ghettos and to killing centers, often called extermination camps, where they were murdered in specially developed gassing facilities. The end of the Holocaust. In the final months of the war, SS guards moved camp inmates by train or on forced marches, often called death marches, in an attempt to prevent the Allied liberation of large numbers of prisoners. As Allied forces moved across Europe in a series of offenses against Germany, they began to encounter and liberate concentration camp prisoners, as well as prisoners en route to forced march from one camp to another. The marches continued until May 7, 1945, the day the German armed forces surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. For the Western Allies, World War II officially ended in Europe on the next day, May 8th, while Soviet forces announced their Victory Day on May 9th, 1945. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, many of the survivors found shelter in displaced persons camps administered by the Allied powers. Between 1948 and 1951, almost 700,000 Jews emigrated to Israel, including 136,000 Jewish displaced persons from Europe. Other Jewish DPs emigrated to the United States and other nations. The last DP camp closed in 1957. The crimes committed during the Holocaust devastated most European Jewish communities and eliminated hundreds of Jewish communities in occupied Eastern Europe entirely.